and welcome. So right now, true crime feels pretty popular, and I don't really have all that much awareness of what that genre contained, so I decided to look into it for myself and see if it was for me. Doing this exploration, I read 11 books, and 4 having to do with specific serial killers, 2 dealing with rape and assault, 2 with robbery, 1 with white-collar crime, and 2 with general forensic technique or law enforcement history. In order to help me figure out what I do and don't like in this genre, I've categorized the books, so please just keep in mind these are books I feel fit true crime and subcategories I think work for them. So I'm going to talk about each subcategory separately, the first being the books I read that focused on a single serial killer each, and I'm going to go in chronological order that I read them. So the first that I finished was Hell's Princess, The Mystery of Belle Gunness, Butcher of Men by Harold Schecter. I got this free through Kindle Unlimited, but I'm glad that it was free. This book follows a female serial killer between 1902 and 1908. It wasn't a long or hard read, but it wasn't particularly memorable either. There doesn't seem to be a lot of work on female serial killers, but that's also because there aren't that many of them. I read this a while ago, and it just didn't stick with me. Despite the uniqueness of the topic, I can't really recommend this, and it doesn't seem many others do either. The second book I finished was American Predator, The Hunt for the Most Meticulous Serial Killer of the 21st Century by Maureen Callahan. This looks at the serial killer Israel Keyes. I personally wasn't that much of a fan of this. Most of it comes from transcripts of the interview with Keyes interjected with other information of the police, tracking, and how he did it. It reads a lot like the interview transcript. And Callahan seems to be calling Keyes smart, meticulous, cunning, and these kind of feel like compliments where it really comes off when you read it as more law enforcement incompetence. Ew. This book was quite popular, so definitely many people's cups of tea, just not mine. The third book that I finished was I'll Be Gone in the Dark, One Woman's Obsessive Search for the Golden State Killer by Michelle Mcnamara, which I listened to as an audiobook narrated by Gabra Zackman. I mentioned this in my summer 2020 wrap-up, which I will link below. This is the one I enjoyed most of the books on single serial killers. Joseph James D'Angelo was caught for these killings and rape, but this was after Michelle's unfortunate passing, where the book was pulled together after her passing and before the arrest. So despite the obvious work that went into pulling together this book, my biggest issue is the feeling of fragmentation. However, I really like the work that showed the law enforcement side through Michelle's partnership with police, and she definitely avoids complimenting the killer in her writing. I would recommend this to people interested, even though overall I don't necessarily think it was for me. The final book that I finished of the single serial killers were Devil in the White City by Erik Larson. This one I also listened to on audiobook, narrated by Scott Brick, and as previously mentioned, I have talked about this in summer 2020 wrap-up. So this looks at the whole life cycle of the World's Fair in Chicago as a backdrop to a serial killer, H.H. Holmes, in the 1890s. At this point, I'm realizing, reading about serial killers, oh my gosh, having to say this word so many times in this video, I'm sorry, I'm gonna mess it up again, may not be for me. So I don't like this either. It's quite disjointed, and I wish he had just written a book about the World's Fair for me, and a second one about the serial killer for anyone who liked that half and not the part about the World's Fair. If you love Erik Larson, this one might be up your alley, but I already know he has better. So that's all of the books focusing on a single serial killer. The next subcategory, I read 2, and these are the books that look at the law enforcement side of catching criminals. The first one I finished was Crime Scene Investigation, whose editor was Cyril H. Wecht. Now, I read this book a couple of years ago, and I really enjoyed it. Broadly, it looks at the current, as of publication in 2004, forensic techniques. It's very introductory and is set up like coffee table textbook, almost, in that size and format. Each section being written by a person in their field of forensics, while looking at also a day in the life of a different law personnel associated with that technique, and also a case file example for that technique where it shines through. I did read this from the library, so unfortunately can't show some of the photos, but would love to read an updated version so I can see how far we've come, or not, since in the last 15 years. The second and last one I read that fits in this vein was Mindhunter, Inside the FBI's Elite Serial Crime Unit by John E. Douglas and Mark Olshaker. I did listen to this one on audiobook, and it was narrated by Richard M. Davidson. And I liked this since the focus was on how criminal profiling came about and how the authors helped bring psychology into play, and the task force they formed to help catch not just serial killers but also other types of criminals. It talks about specific serial killers, but a much more like memoir / history of the task force than anything else, which I found quite interesting. The authors also make clear distinction that when assigning what would typically be a complimentary statement to a killer, it is done to understand the history and rest of them and not meant in any positive way. I don't think everyone will agree with his positions on rehabilitation and the death penalty, but overall I preferred this to any of the books that had a focus on a single serial killer. I do recommend reading this if it interests you, but I personally feel no compulsion to go watch the Netflix show that came about from this book. The third category is a different kind of violent crime, and both books are done in a similar way around a similar case. Both are journalistic reporting turned book, mostly focusing on the Weinstein case by the journalists who brought the stories to light. So the first one I read of the 2 was Catch and Kill, Lies, Spies, and a Conspiracy to Protect Predators by Ronan Farrow. This is one that, as I said, I read first, and I can't say I enjoyed this book, but I am glad to have read it. This one was very focused. It told the story of what happened in the process of bringing the Weinstein case to light. The writing was well done, in my opinion, and I do recommend this book. In comparison to the books about serial killers, I didn't feel as if it was something written out of fascination with the perpetrator, but in an attempt to bring the perpetrator to justice, a distinction that made reading a book about awful crimes more stomachable to me personally. I do recommend this as a read. The second one that I read was She Said, the sexual harassment story that helped ignite a movement by Jodi Kantor. Now, this book, while in the same vein as Catch and Kill, has a much broader focus and covers 3 cases and the Me Too movement more as a whole. While I understand why the author wanted to cover the beginnings of the movement and it covers Weinstein, Trump's public access tape, and Brett Kavanaugh, I think that the book felt like it was being pulled in too many directions. I really like the shift of focus to the women behind these stories and not just how these stories came to be of She Said over Catch and Kill. However, the information is important. I do recommend, but as a whole, it feels a bit disjointed. I do recommend both of the books in this category, though. The final grouping of books I read are very different because they all read about non-violent crimes. So in this subsection, the first one I read was Bad Blood: Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup by John Carreyou. This covers the startup Theranos by Elizabeth Holmes and how she managed to dupe those involved into giving her money and continuing to do research for a blood analyzer that never worked, and how she really pulled it along for so long. At the time of publication, Holmes was just going into trial, and I believe her trial is still ongoing as of this moment. I really enjoyed this book because I was fascinated by the fact that Holmes did the same thing over and over, and people kept falling for it. Because of this book is about that repetitive pattern, some people feel that it can be a bit repetitive of a read. However, for me personally, that was part of the fascination, that no one called her out, or what in hindsight is very obvious rinse repeat pattern. I do recommend this, and I'm curious about other white-collar crimes after this book. The second one I finished was The Feather Thief by Kirk Wallace Johnson, narrated by Andrews Macleod. Since I listened to it on audiobook, this is the third book that I listed in my summer 2020 wrap-up. And this book is the author's story of him learning about the theft of a bunch of birds from the British History Museum and his exploration to learn more. While I thought this book was going to be more about the heist itself, it ends up being much more about the story of the author's learning and journey to understand this case. While not what I expected, I still liked this book, even though with the direction it did take, there are some themes, like obsession, that I wish the author had specifically talked about and delved into more. I do recommend it. It was a good time, and it's such a weird hobby, fly fish tying, which is the hobby that the book explores, that in itself provides some of the fascination of the book. So the final book in this whole exploration, and the only one that I own a personal copy of, so can actually show you, is The Shakespeare's Thefts in Search of the First Folios by Erik Rasmussen. I had a good time with this as well. Rasmussen is a Shakespearean scholar, and the first folios are the first publication of Shakespeare's collected works. Rasmussen has a team that goes around the world looking for these folios and documents where they are and what condition they're in. This is published for use by scholars and collectors in a different book, so not this one. This one is much more a narrative about the folios, some of the more interesting folio histories, and otherwise a collection of some stories Rasmussen has collected surrounding obtaining information for the descriptive catalog he has also written. If you're looking for a book that feels like a detective story, unfortunately, this is not it. However, if you are interested in Shakespearean history and don't mind what feels more like a collection of short, fun stories, I do recommend this book. Overall, there is a lot more variety to true crime than I realized when I started my first book on a serial killer. What I have come away with is that personally, I will not search out books on a single serial killer, and I have no desire to be in their head or really see anything from that perspective, nor do I have a desire to spend that much time examining all of the things that they've done that are quite horrible. I find that to be a bit of a gross factor, and not in the bloody gory sense, but in the visceral, disgusted sense. I do think I will read further about law enforcement and forensic techniques. While this may not be something I pick up regularly, it is something that if I've come across a particularly interesting book, I will pick up. And I will continue to also read journalistic accounts of bringing important stories to light, especially ones I feel are particularly relevant to the current times and contains information I should be aware of, even if I know I won't rank them particularly high in the enjoyment factor, which is also basically the reason I read the Mueller report. I think it contained important information, and it was a necessary read, if not an enjoyable read. I don't know if that counts as true crime. It definitely is investigation of a crime and is true. I don't know. Let me know down below. So all of those I will continue to read. The subcategory I will continue to hopefully read from most regularly is the non-violent crime. I think they're particularly interesting and don't contain the ick factor of violent crime. If anyone has a true crime about books that is very book detective, unlike this one, I would be especially interested in that, and please list it down below. So, are you into true crime, and what draws you in within that genre? Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one. Bye!